So I welcome you now back after this wonderful dinner, and I'm very sure that you will stay alive and awake, even if after dinner it's always difficult not to make a short nap. But I'm sure that our next speaker, Oded Steinberg from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, he will help us to stay awake and not to have a nap. And he's a very interesting topic. He's going to talk about help as resistance, Jews and Armenians in the 19th century. So thank you very much.
So, in order to make you all stay awake, so I'm just transforming like Superman. I'm bringing my protest shirt, which I thought would be a nice idea because we have, not for the Israelis, you know the situation here, but the ones who are abroad. And what I'll do here is basically, you know, I don't know if you know, so it says, without democracy, there's no academia, which is not totally historically right, by the way. There is academia without democracy, as we know, but that's a different story, okay? But I think there's no free academia, and that you said here, there's no free academia without democracy. That is true.
Look at the University of Leipzig under East Germany.
German history is full of such examples, and for that, and I'm also, I must say, I'm very much involved in what's going on here today, and I think it's a very timely, of course, conference, and I'm very happy. And thank you all, and thank you, Aaron, and thank you very much for having me here. And I will start with this very, what I think is a very fascinating, unique case of minorities aiding minorities. In this case, it's Anglo-Jews especially, or we could say British Jews, which is a more, I would say I would follow between these two concepts. But British Jews and Anglo-Jews are basically the same thing. It's just the Anglo-Jews is the term today. Now, what's interesting about here that it's a very, I would say, early example of what we can call modern humanitarianism. Now, I will start by quoting from a certain episode. From then I'll move to sort of a general approach regarding what does it mean minorities aiding minorities. And then I will speak basically on the very, I think, interesting question that the conference, thanks to the conference I thought about, I would must say, which is about, is humanitarian aid sort of non-violent resistance? And I think it's a question which I'm not sure I have a full answer to, but I think we can at least think about this. Okay, so, and I'm quoting now, it was now only proper that every Jew should stand forward, end of quote. The Orthodox Jewish banker and liberal politician, Sir Samuel Montague, stated these words in a public meeting at Whitechapel's Jewish Working's Men Club on the 14th of October, 1896. Montague, who founded and sponsored the club, was a prominent advocate of the persecuted Jews of Eastern Europe, and from 1896, the president of the Mansion House Fund. But rather than aiming to rally Jewish support for his co-religionists in Russia or Romania, Montague spoke on behalf of the suffering Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. The crowd, including a majority of Jews, but also Protestants and Catholics, as the statement said, irrespective of party politics, end of quote, responded with enthusiasm, hailing the cause of Montague and a few other prominent British politicians and religious leaders from all creeds, such as James Bryce, Rabbi Zinger, and others. As reported in both the national and Jewish press, the loud and clear message coming out from the gathering was that the Jews will not sit quietly while members of another minority were being massacred. Okay, yeah, you see it now. Now, the public gathering in London, as the lecture will show, is one example of what I call a British Jewish or Anglo-Jewish community and how it responded to the horrific reports of the Armenian suffering during the Hamidian massacres, 1894-7. I will speak about the massacres very shortly later because I'm not sure all of you, and I was not aware of the massacres 10 years ago when I only started working on this, know about the early massacres of the Armenians, approximately 20 years before the genocide. Now, this action, I argue, is a very early as well as hardly non-attempt of Jews to aid members of other non-Jewish minorities. The lecture will explore this Anglo-Jewish humanitarianism, which it's a question if we can call it really humanitarianism, and I'll speak about this later, which resulted in the collection of funds and the public endorsement of the persecuted and distant Armenians. It will stress, and I will try to stress, that in the context of 19th century, the attempt of one minority to aid another minority outside its immediate religious or ethnic group was an uncommon humanitarian act. Now, the following is Didier Fassin writes, writes on some humanitarian acts is much more a story, and I quote, about us, in this case Jews, than about them, Armenians, end of quote. The lecture thus delves into the dilemmas facing the Jews as the aiding minority. How should one minority respond to the suffering of another geographically, religiously, and culturally distant minority? Must it act, remain silent, or rather show limited sympathy, but remain distant enough? Would a certain action endanger the safety of the Jewish minority in this case, or any minority? These questions retain perhaps greater relevance in the last decade and so, when minorities such as the Yazidis, persecuted by ISIS, or the Sunni refugees of the Syrian civil war, who of course hold a demographic majority in their homeland, but are still considered as a minority under Alawite dominance, knocked or still knock on the doors of the Christian West. Now, I think in terms of the question, of course, and I thought this picture sort of brings the question in, is we need to consider the whole question, is aid really a form of nonviolent resistance? To a certain extent, it is. Well, not only it is, but if you go by the interpretation of Talal Assad and others, when you see the concept of humanitarian intervention, it's not only that it's a non-violent resistance, it's almost a violent resistance to a certain extent, because of course you give aid, but also employ troops sometimes. And if we were going to be cynical, you employ troops in order to gain, I would say, the natural resources of a certain state. And of course, here I remind you of the whole debate about the Second Iraq War and other sort of examples from the last 2, 3, 4, even imperialism, the whole concept of imperialism. So the question if a certain aid is, first of all, non-violent resistance, that's a question which is an open question to a certain extent. I want to bring it to the table, but I think it's very, very relevant. And the other question is the violence or the violent mechanism which is embedded in a certain kind of what we could call humanitarian intervention. Now, saying this, I think another, I would say, concept which came to my mind only recently, because the whole lecture was just accepted as an essay to a journal, and I'm very thankful for that. But one of the reviewers told me, why don't you employ the term, I would say, of what we can call performative allyship, which you see, for instance, since the Black Lives Matter movement, especially, when people show sympathy online, and these people are usually from a privileged group, and they show sympathy towards another non-privileged group. And I thought about this concept. I think it has some relevance to the case of Jews and Armenians, but not the full relevance. And I'll speak about it later. I think it's less fitting, but there are things that I want to take from there. So we have to put the whole question of resistance as aid, maybe violent aid even, on the table. And it's an open question, I must say. I have several thoughts about it, but it's not something that I really implemented in that article, but I think it's very, very much relevant to this conference and so on. Now, I want to also, and in this case, of course, and I didn't tell you, but the main, of course, argument is in the case of the Armenians and Jews, I think it is a resistance. But it's not a resistance going towards the Armenians. It's a resistance of Anglo-Jews against British society. Or in the form they want to put their, I would say, boots on the ground in the sense of, are we really British citizens? And the whole debate in the end of the 19th century, of course, with the rise of anti-Semitism and other facets of racism and so on, is that the Jews are not patriotic citizens. And the way to show patriotism, I would claim, is through aid to other minorities, meaning what they're trying to do is follow the main hub or dominance of a certain stance, which is very much dominant in British society, which means we need to help those Christians in the East against another civilization. In this case, of course, Ottoman Turks. And the claim is that basically the step to aid the Armenians is in order to make the resistance, their own resistance, to find their own place within British society. In that sense, it's a resistance against anti-Semitic, racial arguments which were very dominant in the last centuries of the 19th century against Jews. Okay, so I hope that, and that is my thought about this, and I thought this is very timely in that sense. Now, saying this, there are, of course, precedents. So one of them, which is very not known episode, is actually a case where a minority, which is it's a unique example, but during the Irish famine, for instance, a group of Native Americans are sending money to the Irish, around $750. Okay, if that is a resistance, I don't know if it is, but the case of a minority aiding a minority is certainly there. By the way, during the coronavirus, the Irish are sending back money to the suffering Native Americans. And they're building houses and so on, which is a fascinating example. Another example, which is, this is why the Alliance Israélite is here, and also Montefiore, of course, is another case of Jewish help to other minorities. And I'm referring you back to a very similar story, not exactly similar, during the 1860, 1861 years, where the Druze are slaughtering Maronites in the mountain of Lebanon, and then French as well as British Jews are sending money, donations, writing petitions in order to help those distant sufferers. I would say that in terms of resistance and finding a place, the claim is more valid, I must say, to the later episode of the Armenians. Because I would still argue that the Jews, the whole anti-Semitic wave really of England, even though of course it existed, but it really picked up from the latter parts of the 19th century. Okay, another very important point before I move on is that this minority aiding minority concept, which could be also a form of resistance, depending against who, is also, I would say, some kind of an example of what we can call the watershed of humanitarianism. So basically the movement from what we can call, and I don't like this concept totally, but, or relate to it totally, but the concept of what we could call proto-humanitarianism help, or humanitarian help, and modern humanitarianism. By that I mean that before, if we see the concept of aiding others, throughout history, it's usually aiding someone who's, and I'll use the Hebrew concept here, of Anier Chakodmim. So basically you need to help those which are around you or near you. What we can see, the transformation in modern humanitarianism, to a certain extent, not totally of course, is that people help others which they never met and are very far from them, like the Jews helping the Armenians. It's a claim, I'm not sure it's totally still valid to this point, but I think there's something, a point to think about. Now, this humanitarian act, I would argue, is coming from a very sort of a rational, less sentimental motives. And I think it's this point is very much important. And when I call rational humanitarianism, I mean something which is very much pragmatic. It's not about us Jews in Britain that we want to help those distant Armenians because of universal values and so on. This also appears. But like any other humanitarian act, which involves emotions or what we can call sentimental humanitarianism, there's also very much of a rational choice, meaning that the politics and value of all course, I would claim, not only me, are always very much intermingled. So basically they come together and are merged in what we can call a humanitarian act. There's also something we can also gain from. Now, gain is not in terms of only of profit, of course, material profit, but something which is much more, I would say, realpolitik, much more substantial in that sense. Now, in this case, I will just, and here, of course, all you, the Germans could read, the Germans were really good in maps historically, but here you can say, of course, in German, it says, Verteilung der armenischen Bevölkerung, Turkish Armenia, Kurdistan, and Transcaucasian. Basically, what you see here, a map from the age of the massacres, all those very bluish parts are where the Armenians are situated. This is what we can call historical Armenia. You can see that the bluish most part is actually where Armenia is situated today. I mean, Armenia is a modern state, okay? it's important because we can see, and this is an agreement that is achieved in 1828. This part is being annexed by Russia, and all other parts, and this is the Armenian tragedy, the Armenians do not have any demographic majority. So they're basically under Sunni, either Kurdish or Turkish, sort of a kind of majority. Now, the massacres themselves, I must say, 1894 to 97, between 100,000 to even 300,000 Armenians are being massacred. Hardly anyone remembers that massacre because, of course, the calamity or the big calamity appeared or arrived later, 20 years later, with the genocide. Now, what's interesting here that one could really say that the age of extremes, if we follow Eric Hobsbawm, of course, really started in 1894-97. Because after this, of course, we have the episodes, the Boer War, we have Namibia, of course, with the Germans, we have, and then only the calamities of the World War I and so on. Hobsbawm, I remind you all, started the age of extremes in 1914. Now, I would claim that the genocide or the genocidal era of the 20th century really started to a certain extent with those massacres. It's the biggest number of people which are being massacred by any force, almost globally. I'm excluding China for a second, but almost globally anywhere. And no one hardly remembers those. They start in Sassoon, very much Eastern Anatolia. There's no really European response to it. If you are into the Crusades, of course, the Crusade sort of effect is here. We need to save our Christian brothers suffering in the East. Let's go to a crusade again. This is a bit of a mockery crusade in this Punch magazine because they say, okay, those old crusaders are going to fight again. But the main point is this. It's a civilizational war. This is how they portrayed most of the British, not only British, by the way, but most of the British sort of advocates for helping the Armenians. Now, when we, just before I'll just say thing that this affinity is not only based on Christian affinity, it's also based on racial affinity, meaning that because race became such a very important concept in the end of the 19th century, the claim is that we'll help those Christians not only because they're Christians, but because it's like us, British, French, German, they are also Aryan. So it's almost some kind of racial humanitarianism, if you want. We will help them also because of a racial affinity, not only because of a religious affinity. And that's another claim that I'm, by the way, writing an essay exactly about this point now. Now, when we map the responses after this very, very short introduction about the massacres, one must say there was various, of course, responses. Most of the Jews, including the leaders, and here we see Rabbi Adler was the chief rabbi, and was, by the way, also an anti-Zionist, but that's another connected and not connected issue. They are supporting helping the Armenians. We want to follow the main dominant political view of the British public. We need to support those Armenians. And what they are doing is, from the beginning, they're trying to sort of say, if we help them, they will help us. Meaning, and when they say us, they mean Jews. And they say us, they mainly mean those Russian Jews who are actually suffering, of course, in Eastern Europe, not only Russian, Romanian, and so on and so forth. So they try to make sort of a linkage between the suffering Jews and the Armenians. And some of them, I must say, the claims are totally valid. It's not only sort of a cynical political advocacy for the Armenians. They also say it's a universal, we need by the Mosaic law, religious law, to help the other. You know, the mitzvah on the ger, I don't have to tell most of you, but appears, I think, around 50 times, 36 to 50, I can remember the number, in the biblical testament. So basically, we need to help the other. That's one claim. So it's a universal claim, it's a Mosaic law claim, it's modern humanitarianism, but it's also sort of a practical, pragmatic claim. They will help us. Now, against this, and this is very interesting, there are also some people who basically went against this, and we'll see them in a minute. First of all, as I said beforehand, you'll see here a depiction of the massacres. Here you see basically just a specimen from the Jewish Chronicle. Basically, the cause here is a universal claim. Like I said, we need to help them because such thing is a universal obligation. This is exactly what I'm talking about, the watershed in humanitarianism aspect. It's where this kind of universal notions came to the fore. Of course, one could claim that already in the 18th century, with the Enlightenment and so on, they're already there. But I would say that the transformation, the practical transformation, is only at the second half of the 19th century. This, by the way, a French, well, I don't want to say a caricature, but it's a painted sort of, it appears in the paper. Of course, it's not something that makes mockery or something like so. I don't want to use it, but that's sort of one example. Here, of course, we see the famous Benjamin the Israeli, who, of course, defined himself as the blank page between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You know, that page in between. I never know where I'm situated. This is the Israeli concept of I never know where I am. And of course, these sort of anti-Semitic allegations are going against the Jews in an earlier episode of violence against the Christians. Now, these Jews who are speaking about helping the Armenians, their claim is this. 20 years ago, we had the Bulgarian horrors, where Bulgarians were massacred by the Muslim Turks and by Abdul Hamid and others, the Sultanate. The claim is this: we cannot be, once again, accused of siding by the Israeli and sort of a more pragmatic approach toward what we can call the Eastern question. Hence, at this episode, 20 years later, after what we can call the break of the Eastern question, we need to dominantly side with those who are actually, I would say, are backing any intervention in the butchery of Christians in the East. So in the mind of these Jews, what they're thinking about is we cannot have these anti-patriotic allegations going against us. And here, of course, in the caricature, you see, I don't know if you can see that it says the Eastern question like a graffiti over there. The crowds are shouting in Israeli, do something about the butchery of our Christians back in the East. And the Israeli, of course, is a sphinx is not moving. And these allegations are in the mind of those Jews who 20 years later, during the Armenian massacres, are saying we need to intervene so those allegations will not come against us and will not be accused in having anti-patriotic alliances and so on. So that's another reason. Of course, following the same realpolitik, some Jews were very fearful of any intervention. And they claim very similar sort of approach. They also come from realpolitik advocacy, and they're claiming, listen, if we will intervene in this question of the Armenians, the Turks will actually massacre Jews who are living under the Ottoman Empire. So hence we cannot intervene. And the question, and many of them, not many, it's not the dominant voice, but you see very much sort of a debate within the Jewish press. Many claim that we need to stay silent. We as a minority, we have no necessity, we cannot afford ourselves to rescue our brethren back in the East because the Turks will massacre them. And of course, by the way, some of them even say that Abdul Hamid II, and this is not totally false, the Jews under the Ottoman Empire, to a certain extent, were not comparable to other places. It's a debatable aspect, but they're not so bad off in a sense. They were okay living, I would say, in general. Of course, it's a generalization, but in general, it was okay. Of course, Damascus affair will 5 minutes? Okay, I'm finished. The Damascus affair will show otherwise, but the claim is that basically they are better, their condition is rather good. Now, I spoke about the Mosaic Law. Here you see one example of this. Why aid them? I want to jump to this because I think it's a very, very important point. And with this point before conclusion, I'll finish. What you see here is with this very much sort of a tiny episode, not too so tiny, but a very sort of specific case of minorities aiding minorities, we see greater realpolitics, okay, or greater sort of, I would say, struggles between the powers. It's exactly because of these Armenian massacres that Britain, who was the close ally of the Ottoman Empire throughout the 19th century, and I remind you, of course, of the Crimean War and so on, they wanted to sustain Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman Empire against any fear of Russian expansion. So if we think that the Cold War animosity between the West and the East started in 1945 or 1949, it actually, to a certain extent, already started with the Crimean War or even before. This sort of Russia against the West, in this case, it's Britain. But what happens with the massacres is very interesting. Britain is starting to get away or pull away from this sort of Ottoman affinity, or it's not, they say to themselves, it's no longer our interest to help or sustain the Ottoman Empire. Russia, by the way, is also sort of neutralized, coming closer to both Britain and France. And I remind you, and here you can already see, and of course, who comes into this vacuum is Germany. Now, I want to remind you, if you go to Istanbul today, there's a very sort of big Wilhelm II monument just before the Hagia Sophia. And it's not a coincidence. The ties, the Germans really entered that void that the British Empire left. And then you can also see, and this is the great realpolitik, you can see how the battles of First World War, the World War I are already, I would say the sites are already being manufactured to a certain extent already 20 years beforehand. So we have Turkey with Germany, and on the other side, Russia, France, and Britain. And that is a new thing. It was not the case during most of the 19th century. What's important here, the German Jews knew that. And they followed the main line of the German government. And that's a fascinating case, because they start writing in British Jewish newspapers against that intervention for the Armenians. They said, we Jews need to stay silent, because what they fear that their own government back in Germany will actually operate against them if they will also show any affinity with the Armenians. So it's a very sort of important, very minor example of how this is a projection of greater realpolitik. Okay, by the way, I also went to German newspapers. There's hardly any mention of the Armenians. The main mention in German Jewish newspapers is about the need to stay silent, first of all, and also against allegations that Jews were involved in massacring the Armenians. That's another thing. Now, in conclusion, I would say that I would claim that this is a very untold story of Jewish aid towards Armenians. I think it's more based on a rational rather than a sentimental approach. It's about realpolitik. As I said, following the whole resistance point, this could also be resistance not against the Turks or against or for the Armenians, but mainly a resistance for finding a place within the British society. So basically against those allegations of being not patriotic or against anti-Semitic allegations. There's, of course, a whole theme here. It's also important to see how this is basically projecting the inner conflicts within the Jewish society, but also between the German Jews and the British Jews. So thank you very much, and I hope democracy will win. Thank you.